The exceedingly wealthy have been enjoying socialism in private, demonizing it in public, and forcing the rest of us to live under the brutality of Western capitalism for hundreds of years. And I have proof. Here's an anecdote that I'm going to share with you from Chapter 11 of A People's History of the United States titled Robber Barons and Rebels. In 1887, with a huge surplus in the Treasury, President at the time, Grover Cleveland, he vetoed a bill that would have appropriated $100,000 to give relief to Texas farmers to help them buy seed grain during a drought. So these Texas farmers were essentially starving, and they went to the federal government for help, and someone drafted up a bill that would have given them $100,000. Cleveland vetoed it. He said, quote, "Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character." That type of patronizing language and refusal to extend aid still comes from our government today, by the way. But at the same time, that same year after he said that, he turned around and used his gold surplus to pay off wealthy bondholders at $28 above the $100 value of each bond, gifting the wealthy who were already rich an extra $45 million. Hold on. So at this point, the U.S. government had been passing all of these laws that looked good on paper, and it looked like the laws were laws of reform to make it easier for the average American citizen to survive and just like live day to day. But these laws were always secretly helping the rich and fucking over the poor. It's just that they knew that most people didn't have the literacy level or time to really dig through the jargon of it. And so later that year, that same year in 1887, at his State of the Union address, Grover Cleveland warned all of the wealthy white men sitting around him. He said, "Opportunity for safe, careful, and deliberate reform is now offered, and none of us should be unmindful of a time when an abused, irritated people may insist upon a radical and sweeping rectification of their wrongs." So essentially what he's saying is we need to pass these little pissy ass laws every once in a while and say that they're for reform, or else these abused and irritated people may insist upon a radical and sweeping rectification of their wrongs, showing that he knew that the upper class was abusing everybody else, showing that they knew that what they were doing was wrong and they did it because they could get away with it. So for them to continue this system of hoarding all of this wealth that was generated, mind you, via fraud, stealing, slavery, whatever the case may be, in order for them to continue on with this system, they needed to prevent a massive rebellion from the people. And so in order to do this, they couldn't just use force, like breaking up strikes and stuff, and they couldn't just use the law. They needed to enact psychological warfare on people to convince them and cause them to believe that capitalism is just a fair competition, that only the brightest and the fastest and the most cunning could and should survive. And so they started feeding the people, the American people, this lie that capitalism was fine as it was, and if you don't think that it is, it's just because you're not good at it. And this is where prosperity gospel starts to come from. And now I'm just going to read to you directly from the book, because again, Howard Zinn says it much better than I ever could. This was not just a whim of the 1880s and 1890s. It went back to the founding fathers, who had learned their law in the era of Blackstone's commentaries, which said, quote, "So great is the regard of the law for private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it. No, not even for the common good of the whole community." Meaning, we're going to hoard this wealth and protect our private property, even if it means the rest of you die poor. Control in modern times requires more than force, more than law. It requires that a population dangerously concentrated in cities and factories, whose lives are filled with cause for rebellion, be taught that all is right as is. And so the schools, the churches, the popular literature taught that to be rich was a sign of superiority and to be poor a sign of personal failure, and that the only way upward for a poor person was to climb into the ranks of the rich by extraordinary effort and extraordinary luck. In those years after the Civil War, a man named Russell Conwell, a graduate of Yale Law School, a minister, and author of best-selling books, gave the same lecture, called Acres of Diamonds, more than 5,000 times to audiences across the country, reaching several million people in all. His message was that anyone could get rich if he tried hard enough, that everywhere, if people looked closely enough, were, quote, acres of diamonds. So here's a sampling from one of his speeches. Quote, I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men in America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. That is why they carry on great enterprises and find plenty of people to work with them. It is because they are honest men. I sympathize with the poor, but the number of poor who are to be sympathized with is very small. To sympathize with a man whom God has punished for his sins is to do wrong. Let us remember, there is not a poor person in the United States who has not made poor by his own shortcomings. What the fuck? And so I have seen people asking lately why the rich no longer do philanthropic things like building libraries and building museums and donating to all of these different causes. And it's because they don't have to anymore. They weren't doing that shit out of the goodness of their heart and because they just loved humanity so much and because they just wanted so bad for the common person and the average American to be so educated. That's not why they were doing that. They were doing that. They were putting their names on buildings and donating libraries and building all of these things. So for one of two reasons. One, so that their rich friends could have an opera house to go to. Two, so that they could protect and fortify capitalism. And I'm going to show you how. Again, Howard Zinn says it better than I ever could, so I'm just going to read directly from the book. Russell Conwell, the one who did the Acres of Diamonds speeches across the nation, Conwell was a founder of Temple University. Rockefeller was a donor to colleges all over the country and helped found the University of Chicago. Huntington of the Central Pacific gave money to two Negro colleges, Hampton Institute and Tuskegee Institute. Carnegie gave money to colleges and to libraries. Johns Hopkins was founded by a millionaire merchant, and millionaires Cornelius Vanderbilt, Ezra Cornell, James Duke, and Leland Stanford created universities in their own names. The rich, giving part of their enormous earnings in this way, became known as philanthropists. These educational institutions did not encourage dissent. They trained the middlemen in the American system, the teachers, doctors, lawyers, administrators, engineers, technicians, politicians, those who would be paid to keep the system going, to be loyal buffers against trouble. In the meantime, the spread of public school education enabled the learning of writing, reading, and arithmetic for a whole generation of workers, skilled and semi-skilled, who would be the literate labor force of the new industrial age. It was important that these people learn obedience to authority. A journalist observer of the schools in the 1890s wrote, quote, "The unkindly spirit of the teacher is strikingly apparent. The pupils, being completely subjugated to her will, are silent and motionless. The spiritual atmosphere of the classroom is damp and chilly," end quote. Not unlike a factory. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Joel Spring, in his book Education and the Rise of the Corporate State, says, quote, "The development of a factory-like system in the 19th century schoolroom was not accidental." This continued into the 20th century when William Bagley's Classroom Management became a standard teacher training text, reprinted 30 times. Bagley said, quote, "One who studies educational theory aright can see in the mechanical routine of the classroom the educative forces that are slowly transforming the child from a little savage into a creature of law and order, fit for the life of civilized society." So, mind you, the white colonizers did not just colonize natives, and they did not just colonize Africans, and they did not just colonize the very land that we're all sitting on right now. They even colonized children, and they referred to them as little savages, and literally brainwashed them with this capitalistic text that made them fit for civilized society. Diabolical. It was in the middle and late 19th century that high schools developed as aids to the industrial system, that history was widely required in the curriculum to foster patriotism, loyalty oaths teacher certification, and the requirement of citizenship were introduced to control both the educational and the political quality of teachers. Also, in the latter part of the century, school officials, not teachers, were given control over textbooks. Laws passed by the states barred certain kinds of textbooks. Idaho and Montana, for instance, forbade textbooks propagating political doctrines, and the Dakota Territory ruled that school libraries could not have partisan political pamphlets or books. I'm going to stop there. If you want to read more of that part, just like get the book for yourself. I really want to start talking about how the American people were fighting back throughout all of this, because it ties very much into what we're doing today. But I just had to use these first like 4 parts of this chapter to really set the scene for you and show you how committed the exceedingly rich are to enacting warfare on us, even when we're not thinking about them. We're never thinking about them. But you know how when Cat Williams said, the liar knows the lie that he told. And so the liar is constantly paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, because he thinks that the person that he lied to is going to eventually figure out the lie that he told. That's the reality that the rich people live in. They know for a fact that capitalism is foul as fuck. They know they're wrong. And they know for a fact that they've been selling us this continuous lie for decades, for centuries. And that's why they're constantly enacting war on us. That's why that orange fuck in the White House, that orange demonic piece of shit who should have died years ago in the White House, that's why he's talking about garnishing people's wages over student loan checks. That's why when Biden tried to get student loan forgiveness for everybody, and then these Republicans sued him to keep it in place, like, there's a reason why these rich people are constantly going out of their ways to make our lives harder, because they know that if we ever get the opportunity to figure out what it is that they have done to us for all of this time, then their reign is over. They know the lie they're told, and that's why they're constantly trying to play in our faces and make our lives harder so that it prevents us from uncovering that lie. And I don't want you to ever underestimate the lengths that a rich person will go to stay rich. That's it.